Welcome, everybody. I'm Demitrius Nelon. I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and I work primarily on Winget. It's not only a package manager, but it's also a configuration manager. So first, I want to say thanks to all the sponsors for pulling this conference together. I think this is my 5th year here, and it has been the highlight of 30 years of me going to conferences. This community is phenomenal. I've never been at a conference year over year where everybody engages deeply, has really good discussions, and they try things and they give feedback. So really appreciate that. So the main theme for today is configuration as code belongs on the workstation. You know, we've been doing this on our servers for years, but what happens when you get a new laptop or a new computer? You go through this process of trying to figure out what's all the things I want to install, what do I want uninstalled, and especially if you're doing a lot of work where you're going through a lot of devices, it becomes even more critical to keep you in your flow and keep you productive. And whether you realize it or not, there is a configuration. It's just invisible, and that's where all the problems show up. So last time I was here, we had just previewed and gotten ready to deliver Winget 1.11, and the big thing there was being able to do an export of the configuration on the system. So if you run winget configure export -all-o and whatever file you want it to pass to, Winget will iteratively go through. It will export every single installed package that it knows about from any configured source. It will also grab a few of the Windows settings. And if any of the packages that are installed are DSC v3 capable and they support export, you'll get their settings. So if you have something like PowerToys installed on your system, you'll get about 1,700 lines of JSON configuration just for PowerToys alone. And the idea is this is a logical export. The other thing that we released was Winget Studio as an experimental tool, kind of a GUI so that you can go in and work on these files and test the resources, because we know everybody loves writing YAML by hand. We also did an MCP server. We added some enhancements to that so that now it'll handle upgrade scenarios more gracefully. We've learned that some of the AI tools will try to hallucinate package identifiers and fun things like that. So we've modified the tooling to be a little bit smarter when we built it so that it only retrieves valid package IDs, and then we'll install those. And just as a refresher, our release cadence, we aim for the last Tuesday of February, June, and October, so that we try to make sure that these releases are predictable. They don't fall into cycles where IT professionals are going to be on vacation or want to do a code freeze. But at GitHub, we publish the preview builds almost weekly. The only times they don't go out is either pipelines got broken again and we have to go fix things because of security and compliance, or some kind of a critical bug that was in the system. So as I said, configuration as code also belongs on your workstation. We got that for servers a little more than 10 years ago. We never did it on the desktop, and I think that's a bug. So first thing I'm going to do is a demo. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there are some parts of this that are contrived. I'm using a Microsoft dev box, so when I log in, it's already domain joined. It's already got several things that are set up that are automatically pushed on there that I don't really have a good way to get a clean environment from. I've built a configuration file that I'm going to apply. I've also built a configuration file that's a reset that kind of is the logical undo to be able to pull things off. So this part is going to be particularly boring because you should just be watching a bunch of stuff scroll by. And for your benefit, I have pushed this up to my setup project. So all the files and everything is documented so that you can go along and do the same thing. In this case, what I'm doing is passing in a URL to the raw configuration file. This is an unelevated instance of PowerShell. And what's going to happen is Windows is going to go read through this configuration document. It's going to look at the metadata, the resources that are being called. Some of them will be decorated that they require elevation. You'll see the shield icon for those. And when Winget goes to tell me this is a big scary thing, make sure you know what you're doing before you run the file. As soon as I hit yes, I'll get a single UAC prompt to approve the elevated flow. All of the resources that are not decorated get run as user. Only the ones that are elevated with that decoration get run elevated. And you can see in this case, the font for Cascadia Cove Nerd font actually runs elevated. That needs to be installed machine-wide in order for Windows Terminal to be able to pick up on it. Most of the other ones are just package installers. One of the famous ones, Git, which we all know and love, their installer will detect on its own if you are a member of local administrators. And if you are, it will kick off UAC and elevation. So I've prompted that in here manually by saying requires elevation. Now it's displaying all of the metadata as it's parsing the configuration file that's been specified. And then it will come up with a big yellow wall of text that the legal department requires us to put in there that basically says, hey, this can do anything. This configuration can accept agreements for you for third-party software. It can modify registry keys if you give it administrative access. This is not something to run lightly. When somebody on the internet says, oh, hey, cool, run my config file, make sure you trust them. It's pulling in Oh My Posh now. Oh My Posh by Jan de Dobelier. If any of you are not familiar with it, that's the pretty prompt that I use in Terminal. That was the first third-party software that I'm aware of that did a native DSC v3 implementation. So if you have it installed and configured on your Windows device and you run an export, you'll get all of those settings back out. When you go to a new device and you do a fresh apply where it installs it, it will also restore your prompt and it'll set up the font. The one caveat there is Windows Terminal still needs you to go in and say that you've got that Cascadia Cove Nerd font installed, which is why I'm installing it with Winget so that it can restore my prompt there. Now that we're getting close to the end of this configuration file, you'll see that it's got some resources for PowerShell scripts. And these are doing the pattern of DSC where they support get and test and set. You are responsible for making sure these are idempotent as opposed to a typical DSC resource that's out there. And because these are using PowerShell, you also have to make sure you have that version of PowerShell installed. The earlier version of Winget configuration using v2 could automatically detect every resource was a PowerShell module, so it knew to go to the PowerShell gallery and download them. In the world of v3, we don't have that convenience. Go ahead and say yes here. UAC. So we don't have that convenience in v3. So for example, these resources that are used to configure Oh My Posh and some of the other ones, there's no way for Winget to know before that application is being installed where those resources would come from. So I'll cover some work that we're planning on doing to help with that in the future. So now it's just going to go through and finish installing all the packages. Some of these do not do a pure silent. Winget's current default is to do silent with progress. So we will allow an application to show UI, progress, scroll bars, those kinds of things, but we will not allow packages in the community repository if you have to click next or continue or have to take any interactivity. We do have a pinned issue. This is a potential breaking change we're considering. So would love your feedback if you have an opinion. We are thinking about going ahead and changing the default to a purely silent, no progress indicator. And it's mainly because of things like this. If I'm running a configuration, I really don't want to see things popping up on the screen. One of the other behaviors that we'll see is some applications will auto launch after they install. So there's still some things in the world of software and installers. We're not going to go in and modify their behavior, but we are looking at rational defaults for what you would expect in a world of configuration as code. This configuration is definitely contrived. It's not the exact same thing that I use. The Nelon setup project that I set up is something that I'm going in and adding more and more packages to so that it actually represents exactly what I have on my devices. And I've got probably 12 or 14 virtual machines at a time that I am having to spin up to test different versions of software and do other things with other flavors of the operating system. One of the magical things that's not obvious here is my local device is actually an ARM64 device. I can run a Winget configure export on my local ARM64 device, and I can go apply that to an x64 device. That is a silicon diverse logical backup restore. There's not many systems on the planet that can even partially do that. And the only caveats that I've really had to deal with as pain points are things like there is no ARM64 variation, so it lands on the device as x64 emulated. You will see performance penalties. You will see battery impacts for something like that. So that's definitely something to check out for. As I mentioned before, Git does the fun with the UAC prompt. I think the GitHub desktop that next does something similar. So I may end up getting a UAC in the middle of this configuration file. The process that I would recommend for you going through and doing this is run an export, go through and look at it, pull the things out you don't think you need or you don't think you want. You can use Winget Studio as a tool that we made open source to play with that, make it easier. There's that UAC that I didn't get a chance to clean up last night. And that will get you to a nice starting point. I like going ahead and putting things in a GitHub repo, kind of the dot files pattern that I learned back in the early days when I was doing work on Linux. And I finally have something similar for Windows. So a lot of the slides I'm going to cover after this, I've covered a lot of these topics. I'll try to go through and cover them slightly differently. This is the delightfully boring part of the presentation, I hope. My goal was to make this configuration repeatable and reliable. We did not worry that much about performance. I'll go into some of the details and some of the concerns there. It was really about, let's try to make this thing correct and behave the way we expect it to behave. There are lots of optimizations and performance gains that we can make in the future. I'll take questions at the end. The other thing that I will mention is if you're building tools and you are looking at how do I integrate with something like this, DSC is just JSON lines over standard IO. Super simple, super straightforward. It's not JSON like we see curly braces and carriage returns. It's JSON lines, which is a little bit different. But most of us are starting to leverage AI tooling. AI tooling can talk to the same exact interfaces. You don't need something like this as an intermediary. But if you're setting up your workstation, you probably do want something deterministic, just like you do on the server. So there's really the choice there. And the reason I've been focusing on building these sort of primitive tools and command line experiences is to make sure that the agents and all of the other things that we're using don't have trouble when they're trying to interface with it. So this configuration should be just about done. I'm going to go ahead and open another tab so I can do a list. So one of the new features that we added was the support for fonts. Since that one is installed, I should get a result here if I type it correctly. Space got me. So you'll notice I told it to filter on the font source, and yet I got everything. We fixed that in the latest release candidate. It actually sorts and it filters correctly. I did that on purpose. That's a top feature ask on Winget. It's one of those quality of life things. It's nice to be working on those. I will show you the same thing on my desktop, but if I scroll through, you'll notice several of these have things like ARP machine x86. Winget can still uninstall these. It's not going to be able to install that, but if it has something like what we were looking for earlier, the font name, Cascadia Cove, that shows that Winget knows about that font. And it actually does send the signal out when fonts are installed. So if you have an application like Terminal or something like Word that listens to that signal, it will pick up on those fonts. You may want to install them machine-wide because lots of applications don't pick up on those if they're installed as user. We go back over to our configuration. It completed successfully, which is so much better than last night because I had the preview version on here, the release candidate, and we've got a bug in it. So pay attention to version numbers when you're doing things. Ironically, the last 3 digits of the version number is the same for 1.28 stable and 1.29 release candidate. So I'm going to come back to the presentation. We'll cover some of the topics. All right, so when we look at going from the V2 configuration syntax to the V3, there are definitely some things that are different. And the challenge I ran into was understanding what is a great way for me to build a converter. And I thought about something that could go through and parse it and translate and do lookups. That ended up being problematic. So what I ended up doing was just building a skill and going through multiple sessions, multiple turns with multiple different agents to try to come up with something that was reasonably reliable. And I included the performance data in there. And that skill is open source at the Winget DSC repository. Definitely still needs some work. Adapted resources in DSC are something that will call straight through and they'll run. But if you have a lot of those resources in your configuration file, it's going to be very slow. If you've got something where you've got a native PowerShell class-based V2 resource, I would just leave that as it is rather than convert it. You're better off with idempotence than you are with making a mistake in your script. That performance wall, when I was measuring it on another device, I was seeing about 92 seconds of performance hit per resource. And that's because Winget is calling DSC as a singleton. So DSC was having to go do a resource lookup, which is looking at the local cache of all the V3 resources. And then it was walking along the disk directory access paths looking for where things are. There are some techniques and some things that are in progress that are going to improve that. Heiss has written a great blog on that performance improvements. I've done some testing with it. It is really good. And I do have that linked as well. But something like just doing 20 resources, 30 minutes, that's a long time to be waiting for that to happen. It's a coffee break. And then when you do that, what happens is your screen goes dark if you work at Microsoft after 15 minutes and you lose your Wi-Fi. And then you can't download the packages and you get to start back over again at the beginning. The good news is the Winget packages, if they're already installed, it does do a no-op. It does a test to see if it's there before it does the install. So today, that is the pattern for DSC. It's going to look and see, is the system in the desired state first? If it is, then it's a no-op. If you're using a script resource, make sure that you build something in for that. The common pattern I see in most places is people just say return false. So you end up doing that work over and over again. Package installs are idempotent. Where you want to pay attention is if you need a specific version or if there's different versions of the dependencies on the system, you could end up in that state. So if you're trying to do regression analysis or you're trying to get an environment set up in an exact certain way, specify the version of what you want. And yes, if a newer version is installed and an older one is present, Winget will uninstall the newer version and install the older version. Settings in terms of their idempotence are going to be mixed. I've seen some resources that will support a clean apply and they'll set everything correctly and they don't necessarily export things out. So you'll definitely want to test with those things. And with those adapted resources, if you rerun the same configuration, you don't get any of the caching benefits that you get for the V3 resources. So that performance penalty is very real. Sometimes it's better to optimize the configuration if time really matters to you. So I talked before about the round trip on the nature of this being a logical backup and being able to switch architectures. I only ran into one case where I had a package installed on the ARM64 device and I went to my x64 device and it failed. And that's because that package is actually ARM64 only. It was designed for looking at ARM64 registries and some other things in the system. So it basically failed on that resource, but all of the other resources were applied. So something else I love to do is talk about all the real sharp edges. I don't want to come up here and say, we built this perfect product and everything is great. Configuration as code is a really complex domain. There's a lot of challenges that are intrinsic. And even just with Winget, the chicken and egg scenario of bootstrapping is a real challenge. We check in Winget into the operating system. It could be 6 months before you go get a fresh Windows install and you go in and you run Winget and it doesn't work. It might have been on Windows 10, it wasn't installed. It might have been on Windows 11, the store certificate was expired or it didn't support dependencies. We're getting closer to this problem not being real, but it is today. So that bootstrapping scenario that I showed before, the first thing I would do, getting onto a fresh Windows device, go update everything from the store. That's going to save the headaches of Winget being out of date. You're going to get a current version of it. It'll also update all the other apps from the store. And then from there, you're in a known good state. We are working on addressing this, but there are some requirements that we have for some of the OEM hardware vendors. You don't want to buy a brand new PC, get a home, log in, and then it's just slow doing all the updates. So those first 15 minutes, we're trying to leave the system alone and let you get in and play with the hardware. And then after that, those downloads will start coming in. One of the other things that's kind of obnoxious, and you saw it with the GitHub desktop app or the GitHub CLI, UAC prompts, sometimes installers will have those prompts in there. You'll want to go in and say that it requires elevation in your configuration file to avoid that from happening. I talked about the performance problems. And then the other one, there's another feature in Winget that a lot of people don't know about or are slightly confused about, and that is just the basic Winget export, Winget import. It's just going to give you a JSON file with some packages. It's just a convenient way to reinstall all the packages, but it doesn't do anything for settings. One of the things I'd like to do is go ahead and make it where you can run Winget import and Winget configure as synonyms and make them just both understand both file syntaxes to be able to handle that. For export, I probably won't break it. We'll probably just have an argument so you can say Winget export and make an argument like configuration or something like that. So I talked about that a little bit. The adapted resource manifests, this is one of those performance things that I was talking about. What happens is when DSC is doing the walk looking for those resources on your disk, if it finds one of these files, it will actually cache it like it's a v3 resource. So things will run faster the second time around. The first time when it's analyzing it, looking at the configuration file, it'll hit that performance hit, it'll cache it. And then when you actually run, you get that native performance. The other thing I'm looking at is first-party resources in Windows. I want to have all of the Windows settings, all of the File Explorer settings, all of your Task Manager settings, anything that's native in Windows. I want that to be a v3 resource so you get that native performance. And when you export and go from one device to the other, everything gets preserved. Taskbar on the left, dark mode, hidden files, all of those things. Most of those are what I would say well-known registry keys, but they're not documented, so I cannot build open source code around them. The most common pattern I see in people's configuration files is a set of change this registry key so I can get that setting that I want. The PowerShell team did build a list resource that's coming out in the next version of DSC that will compress that file down so all the registry keys are in one resource. And you'll get faster performance than having to go through and warm that thing up every time you change one key. The other thing I'm looking at is adding the metadata for known resources in the Winget repository. If Winget knows that Oh My Posh has 3 resources, configuration can take advantage of that knowledge, and I can at least tell you this configuration file will or will not work, either because the application is or is not on the system, or is not in the configuration file. And I've seen cases when I'm iterating on things that I'll just do a short config file to toggle things back and forth, and that works great. Then I go to another device that doesn't have the application installed, and it fails. So my goal with getting that metadata in there is giving you that v2 magic that we have for pulling in PowerShell modules to be able to do the same thing for the v3 resources. So here's the call to action that everybody loves at the end of their slides. So I would suggest just start with one resource, build a very simple configuration file, and iteratively build that up so that you've got a machine that represents one of the devices that you would like. You can use the Winget configure export as sort of a starting point, but that file can be massive if you have PowerToys and Winget and a handful of other things installed that use the configuration. It's a lot of noise to chew through. My setup project and the demos that I showed are open source. So all of those are available for you to go play with, and I'm happy to take PRs on my repository. So this is the slide you want to take a picture of that's got all the links to everything. The Winget samples just takes you into where we do a lot of the open source work on the Winget DSC repository. All of the modules we built are documented. I have both V2 and V3 configuration samples for all of them. That's where the skill that I built for Copilot to convert resources is. We've got Winget Studio, which is a visual playground for you to go in to look at your configuration. It can validate and run it and test it. There's also a resource playground, so you can go fiddle with one resource at a time, change settings, and you can play with get, set, and test. Winget CLI is also open source, and the Winget Packages community repository is available as well. I think the last time I checked, we have 12,500 packages in there, and we're running something on the order of 3,000 to 3,500 pull requests a week. So there's a lot of activity that's going on that one. Lots of interesting things that you'll see if you like watching the bots talk to each other as we try to automate everything. So I've got some demos I can do with the Winget CLI real quick, and then we'll take questions. So on this device, I've actually upgraded it from the stable version to the preview. I ran list on the stable version, and you'll notice we get out of alphabetical order very quickly. If I go down below where I've got the current version, you'll notice things are now in alphabetical order, and they're filtered to what's in the Winget source. So now if I do the font filtering, it will only show me things that are installed from the font source. You can see that I've got the 2 fonts that are in there now. We are finishing up the work on the pipelines. We'll be accepting public contributions for fonts, and that'll be coming probably in the next month, month and a half. Going through and building all the pipelines and validating all of that is always taking longer than we thought it would, but it is finally getting out there. The next one we're going to add is the official Cascadia code font from Microsoft as an end-to-end test. One of the other things, if you look with source list, you'll notice the column on the right is explicit. That is an indication of whether or not it requires explicit targeting. We've had a lot of people that have said, hey, I go in, I do a search, I get conflicting results, or I get duplicate results from multiple sources. Why am I getting Power Toys from the store and Power Toys from the community repository? This is your chance to kind of turn that off without removing the source. You just go in and set it the way you want it. So I can do source edit, and of course it's a CLI, so the typing is fairly long. But if I set it to true, requires elevation. Don't know how many you realize sudo is on Windows now. So now if I do the source list, you'll see that the store requires explicit targeting. The other thing that we've done, and I'm gonna use the font source as the example here. And I'm going to do a quick search. So if I do a search for Power Toys, I'm going to get the one result from the community repository. Winget has a default preference ordering. We're going to look for whatever you gave us as the query string. In this case, that's Power Toys. We're going to look in the name, the ID, moniker, and tags. And we're going to sort based on relevance. Most of the time, the result that comes at the top is the one you're looking for. The most common pattern that people use is Winget search. Then they'll do Winget show to see what is this package, where did it come from. It scrolled off the screen a little bit. We have icon metadata for a lot of the packages. That's coming from the apps where applications get installed. We do not show those at GitHub. We pull them in and cache them so that we're not offending anybody by using their bandwidth to point at their icons. It also does have the same hash protections on it before it gets pulled down. But this way we can see, okay, yeah, this is the Power Toys that I want. If I turn the store source back on, and do that search again. The store typically will return one result that is what it thinks is the best one. It used to be at the top of the list. If you look now, it's the second from the bottom based on the relevance logic from Winget. So we now actually coalesce all of the results across all configured sources, and we attempt to use that same relevance logic. But you'll be able to go in and specify your own sorting criteria as well. I'm not going to go through all that. The syntax is kind of what you would expect. You can do ascending, descending. You can specify the columns that you want, and you can go in and apply that in your settings as defaults. All right, so we'll do Q&A, and I'll leave the QR code up for anybody that's willing to give me some feedback on the presentation. Any questions? Yeah. So the question is, will Office be available through Winget? Are you saying installing it or configuring it? So there is an installer for Microsoft.Office. It's using some default parameters. It was something that was put in a few years back as a hackathon. It just uses a default template. So it's not going to pick up your enterprise settings from enterprise, but if it's just a personal license or something like that, it will install. It may require one relaunch to get it to function correctly, because that's typically what's happening when it's trying to get the metadata from the Exchange server that you're trying to connect to when you join it to a domain. And then on the configuration side, I have not talked with the Office team yet. They have a lot of settings in there. That would be a very big ask, but they are on my list of teams to go talk to. Kind of internally, we have about a half a dozen applications that we look at as sort of our biggest applications. And anytime I go talk to them, they go, well, how many people are using configure, and when is Windows going to do that in the settings? So I'm going to have to go do some work on my side and get a few more of you using it to build up that business case to go back to them and ask them to do that. Yes. So the question is this going to replace Windows Backup in the future? So I don't think this is going to replace a binary Windows Backup. The logical backup that Winget does is wired into the current Windows Backup mechanism, but it's not in the restore mechanism. A lot of the concerns there were early on from people being concerned about the community repository potentially representing an attack vector. I would say in the last 6 years at this point, we have had maybe 4 or 5 cases where something had gotten past malware detection on the initial scan and then later became known, so a 0-day. We take that very seriously. If somebody says this package is malware, we delete it first, and then we let them go attempt to re-add it again later. And the amount of both static analysis and dynamic analysis that happens on packages before they get into the community repository is very substantial. It's all documented. We also periodically rescan every single installer in the repository, looking for any new critical CVEs or any malware. We have a couple of popular packages right now that are blocked from some new detection types. So I will have to go through the process of changing some policies. Unfortunately, if you're someone who loves to use Rustdesk or Malwarebytes, they were the 2 packages that got picked up with some new detections from some partner engines. So getting new versions of those in is going to require me to do some policy changes and some work in Winget. So the comment is, if it was just based on Windows settings alone and being able to restore that, that would be a good starting point, and Intune would be able to push it in.
Intune could handle the application. That's what whatever. But the actual setting is.
So the
backup handles a little bit of Windows, not much. You could have an add-on.
Yes. So the comment, I think the feature request is, could we make it where applications that have settings could have their settings backed up? And the answer to that is yes. You can do that today. You can either go directly against DSC, and you can call the export on anything that supports the export verb, or you could go in and call Winget directly and do a full export of Winget. You could associate that back with the user profile and wire it all up. I know there are some fairly large organizations that are actually building some custom implementations of that today. Yes. Yeah, so the question is, if I have a configuration file, it's great, it's got my settings, but what if there are things that are not in the configuration file? I might not want my secrets or credentials or things like that in there, or the configuration file becomes less useful if it only works on one device. DSC itself has two mechanisms. One is a variable. So you can go inside of the configuration file, you can define a variable, you can give it a default value. When you invoke the configuration, you can pass the value that you want used in. So that will be sort of logically, you get a default or an override. The other one is parameters. Parameters is probably more what you're looking for. So you would be invoking the configuration file. You would specify the values for the parameters you want to pass in. Those would get transformed at runtime. DSC XE natively supports that. Winget does not yet. Winget is using a very old schema version, and we're working with the PowerShell team on an intermediary schema so that as the PowerShell team moves forward with newer versions of the DSC schema, we can have a standard one that we agree on so that Winget doesn't have to have quite as much churn with the speed that DSC is evolving. We don't want to add that much more churn to our customers, which surprisingly, we've got more IT pros than developers using Winget at this point. So we're really focusing on being stable and predictable. And that's kind of at odds with going as quick as DSC. But once we have that in place, we'll get the configuration document, we'll pass it to DSC. It will standardize it back to a schema we understand, and then we'll be able to take variables and parameters and pass them in. Yes. So the question is referring to Winget Studio. It's currently experimental. And the question is, what do I see in the future? What I ran into building a lot of configuration files was I just didn't enjoy writing the YAML by hand. That's really what it came down to. And I figured I wasn't the only one. So I thought to myself, let's build something that gives us a pretty view on the YAML. It's got both sort of a visual editor mode. It's got a more of a sort of raw editor mode. It's using the same engine that VS Code does. We've also got a PR that will render a visual depiction of the graph of the configuration document. And there's the resource playground so that you can go play with the resource. In addition to that, I want to be able to extend it so that it can also act as an intermediary so that you could use something like the Winget community repository as an upstream. You could point it at a private enterprise REST source. It would know how to pull the manifest down, pull down the installer, allow you to specify where you want to put the installer inside of your enterprise, modify that manifest and put it up. And it'll give you controls for things like, do you want the latest, N version of all of the tools, or do you want N-1, or do you want it to kick off a process to go do some testing? We also have the challenge with people authoring manifests. We built Winget Create as a CI/CD tool, so that as soon as you publish your application, it can just generate a pull request to the community repository. We're going to add support for that to submit to REST sources so you can use the same tooling for your line of business apps. But there's a lot of different functionality around package management and configuration management, and that's really what I've been aiming at for Winget Studio. But I'm really not looking at it being a mainstream, developer, GUI for Winget or meta package manager. I don't have any designs around that at all. Yes. So the question is about enterprise or private resources. We have a reference implementation of one, very heavyweight. It was designed originally for us to stand up a mirror of the community repository at global scale. So it's using Cosmos DB and a bunch of other heavy infrastructure. It is something that you can download the PowerShell module and deploy if you want to deploy it on Azure. That could be expensive, and it's also pretty heavyweight. There are some open source and some commercial alternatives that offer both hosted and on-prem solutions. Rather than us going in and building something like that, it's more likely we would just reference those. We've already got a page on the Winget CLI resource project where we identify those. We're happy to add more pointers. There's no endorsement. It's just trying to let everybody know what's available and what's out there. I've definitely heard of one that's based on Docker. I believe it's Python and SQLite internally. So it's a nice lightweight option. If you don't want something heavyweight for enterprise, it might be nice if you're doing small network or air-gapped types of scenarios where you need to bring something into an air-gapped network. But I don't think we have anything that we would plan on doing in the near term that's going to be a smaller, lighter weight implementation ourselves. Yes. Great question. Any future support for running in system context? So this is a lovely one. We do have work lined up that is going to deal with some of the challenges of MSIX in, NT authority, local system context. There's a lot of different ways we describe it. Technically, it's not exactly what we describe, but there are two challenges. One is when you install it, it needs to have the bits laid down on the system. That's fine. And we need to say whether or not it's teed up to be registered for a user to use. So that's the registration part. We're going to have to do work to be able to register those applications in that context. The other bit of work we have to do is when you go to invoke it, today they use app execution aliases. We will have to build some kind of a mechanism for that to function as well. That work is on the roadmap. I don't think you're going to see it anytime soon. My gut would tell me that it probably be about a year at the earliest, just given the Windows release cycle. And we would do that same work to make that work on Windows Server as well. That will also be one of the things that unblocks having packaged PowerShell 7 available to run on system context for those devices that you want to connect to remotely or manage or orchestrate locally. Awesome. Well, I don't see more questions, so really appreciate everybody taking the time. Looking forward to the feedback, and thank you so much for having me.